Tip 4. You mentioned previously mechanisms. So tip 4 is inquire into mechanisms. So, you might have tried something in the classroom, or your school may have mandated that you do something in the classroom, and you may get a good result, or you may get a bad result. Usually what we do there is we say, oh, that worked, or oh, that didn't work. But inquiring into mechanisms is essentially a nudge for us to go a bit deeper and to actually ask the why. So, for example, an interesting example is using your kind of silent worked examples, Craig. It's like, okay, I do silent worked examples, and students learn more. That's cool. Like if that's the case, but we can then ask the question, why is that? Is it because they have increased focus and there's less distraction in the classroom? Well, if so, maybe actually there's a better way to do that than being silent. Don't know. Is it because they're actually systematically following every step of working that you're doing? Is that the active ingredient? If so, awesome. But maybe there's a better way. Maybe Michael Pershin's approach is better. Maybe it is actually the silence. Maybe there's something about silence that helps students learn maths. I don't know, in which case you couldn't take that silence away. So when we inquire into mechanisms, we actually work out what part of the thing that we do is most likely to be generating the effect. And this is really valuable. It's valuable for a number of reasons. It's valuable because it helps us to make more reliable predictions of the future. Because if we know what the active ingredient is, we know if it's taken out, it's probably not going to work as well. It allows us to modify strategies and approaches without lethal mutations. Which is a phrase that gets bandied around a lot these days. But, a recipe is very, very good in a stable environment, but unfortunately teaching is not a stable environment. Different students, different days, different weather, different cohorts, different amount of sleep that you've had, and all these things are factors. But if we're aware of the core part of what we're trying to do that generates the effect, we can actually adapt what we're doing in such a way that it hopefully has the intended effect even through those adaptations. And in relating to adaptation, it enables us to save energy, time, resources. Because maybe there's a strategy we're doing that has 10 steps, some feedback approach or whatever it may be, and we know we've been doing it for 5 years. It always gets really good action from the students, or responses from the students, good learning, but maybe there's only 3 of those steps that actually have an impact, and we're doing all these other things like cutting up the staples or like using different colored highlighters. That's actually a complete waste of time. So that's that takeaway. I can't remember what we're up to, 3, 4, 5 now. Inquire into mechanisms. That's a level 1. Level 2 of this takeaway is, I don't actually know what a mechanism is. So to expand on that, one paper that talked about mechanisms a lot October last year, was the one by the EEF run by Sam Sims. And their definition of mechanisms, a phrase that they use interchangeably with active ingredients, was an active ingredient is a component of PD that could not be removed or altered without changing the impact of the PD on teaching and learning. Now that sounds sensible. That kind of relates to what I was saying. But does that mean that oxygen is an active ingredient of PD? I definitely agree that if you remove the oxygen of the PD, that would likely change the effect. But oxygen itself is like an entity. It's like an element within. It's not. Is it a mechanism? I thought that the mechanism is something about the causality. So maybe it's about the connection between. So that's confusing me a little bit. Then I thought, all right, maybe I know that a really good way to describe mechanisms is with like if-then statements. So if we think about cold call, I gave a presentation at this Step Lab conference recently. I was trying to look into we were trying to dissect the mechanisms of a cold call. And this is one of the definitions that was come up with using the if-then framework. If students are sufficiently motivated to appear knowledgeable to the class, then knowing that they may be asked a question at any time will drive them to engage with it and prepare an answer, right? So that's one approach. Another approach for describing mechanisms is using the by statement, which is, I think, Bambrick and Toyo. So coming back to cold call, sustain a high level of student focus throughout the lesson by making it unpredictable when the students will be asked a question, right? But then when I started to think about and dissect that more, I mean, those things, they seem pretty clear. It's like, makes sense. It's part of the mechanism of cold call. Another one is the check for understanding part, of course. But then I started to think, well, maybe is there actually anything different than between a mechanism and just having a goal and a step? So the goal could be help students attend to instruction more, and the step is make it unpredictable when you call on them. Like, what part of the goal versus step is the mechanism? Is it like the in-between part? Is it how they come together? Is it... I don't know, Craig. I'm confused. What is a mechanism? So I think some other hypotheses I had were like, maybe it's your ability to answer a number of why questions in between. So that shows you've got to understand. But it's kind of like this... I don't know. I've read a lot of stuff about mechanisms recently, and I think they're really important. I just don't really know what they are. But maybe that's love. Love's really important, but like, what the heck is love? So maybe mechanisms are important as love. I don't know. Anyway, that's the level
deep
2.
I like this. So again, usual thing. One reflection from me, then one question. Something you hit on really early on. I've done this lots. You change too much, and you can't. I mean, even changing one thing, it's hard to identify what impact it's had to dissect it, but as soon as you start changing 2 or 3 things, it's just a disaster waiting to happen. And I have this myself. You listen to a podcast like your own, or you go to a CPD session, you get 2 or 3 different ideas, you think, right, I'm going to implement those tomorrow, and then the lesson either goes well and you don't know why, or it's a disaster and you don't know why. You've changed too many variables. So certainly it feels, before we get to the nitty-gritty of mechanisms, it feels important just to narrow that change down to just one thing if possible. The second kind of reflection before I ask you the question is also sometimes when we change something, well, almost inevitably when we change something, we have to stop doing something else. And I think that often gets overlooked a little bit. We may inadvertently stop doing the one thing that was making all the difference. Silent teacher's a good example of this. It may be that the teacher's speaking at that initial exposure to an example is the key thing. And if we take that away and replace it with silent teacher, maybe silent teacher brings another benefit to it, but we've removed a really key thing. So it's always worth reflecting on what, and sometimes it's hard to spot, what have we taken away here to replace it with this new idea. But here's my question for you all. With all the fact that you're confused about these mechanisms, and I don't have a bloody clue, I can tell you that much for free. What do you do when you're instigating a change then? Or what's your process? Let's say you listen to a podcast or whatever, or you read some research, you want to change something. How do you go about doing it? And how do you know if it works?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it's just comes back to maybe that thing I was referring to at the end there. It's like, to what extent can you suggest a potential causal connection between the proposed action and the desired outcome? And if you can say that, yes, there's pretty clearly a causal path here, and you can articulate that causal pathway, which is something you would have seen me write about a little bit in Tools for Teacher as well, if you got to that chapter, then I think the mechanism's there. But I guess the confusion for me is like, not whether a mechanism is present or not, but more about like what part of the causal chain between action and outcome it constitutes the mechanism. Is it the whole thing? Is it the step, the mediation? Is it the moderation? Is it the goal? Is it the action?
Just one final reflection on this all. And it's really interesting you brought up silent teacher here, because sometimes I see 2 different things going on when you try and bring in silent teacher. So the first is often you get like a honeymoon period where the kids, because it's so novel, they're just like, what is this? And their full attention's on it. So the danger there is you do this 1 or 2 times, you think, I've cracked it. This is the revolution I've been waiting for. But then obviously the novelty wears off, and then maybe kids go back to being a little bit more disengaged and so on and so forth. So I think when you bring in something new, be aware of the honeymoon period. But then also, and I think we talked about this last time when you were talking about Tools for Teachers on my Mr. Barton Maths podcast, this notion of this valley of latent potential. When you bring in a new idea, often there's a big lag before you start to see the benefits of it, because it's not been embedded. And students are really focused on the structure of the idea versus the content of the idea and so on. So that's just 2 added extra complications, right? When you try and make a change, you've got to be aware of this honeymoon period and aware of this kind of, valley of latent potential. So you may only see whether this is working. It may take a month or something like that. And if it's not working, that's a month's gone by, you know, where, you know, the opportunity cost, your kids could have been doing something more effective. It's tricky, isn't it? But yeah, have you considered that this honeymoon and this latent potential? It feels like they're two kind of competing factors that come into play when we try and make a change.
Yeah, it's huge. And I mean, that relates as well to another really important point about mechanisms, and that's the Hawthorne effect. So this is something they've found in a lot of studies. Simply by the act of conducting a study, if people know they're being studied, they try harder at whatever the thing is. I think traditionally it was kind of factory workers and their productivity. It's like change the lighting in the factory. The workers are like, oh, someone's watching us and measuring what we're doing, so we better act. And so, like, what's the mechanism there? Well, watching surveillance, essentially. So often it's really quite difficult to kind of split it apart. I was going to say something else, I've completely forgotten.
Last final bit, all then, just to dig into it practically. Let's say, for example, after our chat today, you think, right, I'm going to go for it with this silent teacher. Forget Persian; he doesn't know what he's talking about. Silent teacher is the way forward. How would you determine whether it works or not? Like, what are you looking, and over what period are you looking for it to get this data back?
Good question. First, I'll say the thing that I remembered I was going to say before. What I was going to say before was this valley of latent potential is particularly prevalent when we come back to that learning to learn or self-regulated learning stuff, right? Because teaching, like, there are a few things quicker and more direct route in terms of getting students to high performance than highly structured instruction where the teacher is 100% in the driver's seat and the students are working really hard to keep up the whole time, and they manage to keep up. I think that can, you know, and we see a lot of really effective explicit instruction going on, and that's absolutely fantastic and a really important tool for teachers to have in their toolbox. But again, opportunity cost, if we do that 100% of the time, we miss out on a lot of the potential gains and the longer term benefits in particular of creating more independent learners. But when at the time we're trying to make that transition, should I say, we're likely to see a significant dip in scores for an extended period of time. Which brings us back to the other question you just asked. How do you know if it's working? Well, check for understanding. Check for understanding. But the other part you asked was over kind of what period of time. And like, I don't know, Craig. To me, it kind of comes back to it does come back to mechanisms. Does it seem like the effect that you're expecting is happening? And does it seem like it's plausible that it's happening because of the reason that you think it's happening? But also, a lot of teaching isn't all quantifiable, and sometimes you have to just get a sense of things.